Welcome to our video on psychosocial development in late adulthood. What is it like to be an older adult? As you've read, aging brings with it both physical limits and psychological gains. Old age also brings social challenges. Older adults are sometimes stereotyped as being marginal and powerless in society. How does this affect older adults? How does this affect their aging process and how they see themselves? Understanding how people grow old is not as simple as asking someone how old they are. Aging is an individual process that involves many variations across people. Psychosocial approaches to aging recognize these individual differences. One of the most important aspects of research on older adults has been the adoption of a more multidimensional view that includes productive engagement with life and social involvement. Some researchers use the term successful aging, and this denotes a pathway through late life that focuses on positive outcomes through health and social engagement to achieve well-being. However, there's considerable debate about what exactly successful aging entails. In this video, you're going to be learning about the socio-emotional aspects of aging and the interactive nature between the cognitive, psychosocial, and physical changes that people are experiencing during this time of life. We're now going to be exploring psychosocial development in late adulthood. By the time we are done with this section and after you've read your textbook and you have watched some of the relevant videos for this module, you should be able to explain the stereotypes of those in late adulthood and how it impacts the lives of people during this stage of their lives. You should also be able to summarize Erikson's 8th psychosocial stage of integrity versus despair and explain how self-concept and self-esteem affect people in late adulthood. You should also be able to identify the sources of despair and regret and describe the paths to integrity, including the activity, socio-emotional selectivity, and convoy theories. You should also be able to describe the continuation of generativity in late adulthood and describe the relationships in late adulthood that people have with their children and other family members. You should be able to also to describe singlehood and marriage and widowhood and divorce and remarriage in late adulthood and describe the different types of residential living during this period. You should also be able to describe friendships in late life and explain the concerns that are experienced by those in this stage of life, like abuse and mental health issues. Many older adults experience ageism, and this is prejudice based on age. What role do you think that the media and companies that produce products like skincare creams and beauty creams, what role do you think they have in promoting ageism? I think about comedy shows where older people are portrayed as clueless and that they may be made as the butt of jokes. I think about ads for anti-aging creams that are equating youth with beauty and wrinkles with decay. I think about harsh and unflattering images overall that shape the assumptions about aging. And I think that too, although people may hope for good health and happiness, many may tend to believe that growing older involves decline or deterioration. All of this can contribute to a self-fulfilling prophecy as people start to experience the changes that are associated with growing older, like aching knees or problems with hearing, for example. And then a person may internalize negative stereotypes and their confidence may be eroded. Sometimes this can lead to stress responses and reduced motivation. Someone, for example, may think to themselves, I'm old, it's too late to change things, or I'm old, I'm not able to do this, or I don't want to bother people, or people may have a reduced sense of self-efficacy, saying to themselves, I can't do that, feeling as though they're just not capable, when in fact they very well are. Older adults who are non-white are vulnerable not only to ageism, but also to racism. We could think about older people who are non-white and who are women, And we could think about, in particular, their experience of what's known as triple jeopardy. So those individuals are experiencing these isms, ageism, racism, and sexism in three different areas. And this can be very damaging. It can significantly affect the mental health and physical health of the individual experiencing this. Poverty is a significant problem for people living in late adulthood. Over 25 million Americans who are over age 60 are economically insecure. This means that they're living at or below 250% of the federal poverty level. This is a significant issue because we can think about things like rising healthcare costs. We can think about rising housing costs, inadequate nutrition, and lack of access to transportation, diminished savings, and job loss. It might just be one life event that leads a person who is in late adulthood, who has a low income, to lose a tremendous amount in their life. For example, let's imagine that a person who's in late adulthood becomes very sick and they have unexpected medical care costs. This then may force them to decide between eating nutritious food and paying for medical bills or paying for their prescriptions. Women are particularly vulnerable to poverty as they move into late adulthood. They're actually 70% more likely to be poor than men. If we look at some of the reasons for this, one of the reasons has to do with women receiving less annual Social Security benefits than men. And this is because over a lifetime, women tend to earn less money. And since Social Security is based on your history of wages, this then can contribute to lower wages and lower income for older women. In addition, we can think also about the income gap that still exists between men and women. We know that for women who are uh, white women, they make about 81 cents for every dollar that a man makes, but we know that it's even less for women who are minorities. So poverty is more prevalent among older racial minorities, and it's even more prevalent among older racial minorities who are women. Married couples are less likely to be poor, but we could also think about how in late adulthood, this is when we tend to see more disease and more illness and many people experiencing widowhood. When you think about later adulthood, what do you think about their living arrangements? What do you imagine they would be like? I think there's a misconception that many people living in this stage of life live in nursing homes, but in actuality, only about 3.2% of people in this age group live in nursing homes. This does tend to increase with age, so we would see a much lower number as we look at the ages of 65 and 70 and 75 versus someone who's in their 90s. Also, I think it's interesting to point out that we don't have a lot of intergenerational households in this country. This probably has a lot to do with our cultural variable of individualism. If we look at cultures in other parts of the world where there's much more collectivism, you will see that there is a much greater likelihood that there would be intergenerational households. Also, the number of people who are living alone that are in this age group has declined since the 1990s. What we tend to see is that older women are tending to live with their spouse or their children, so that when a spouse dies, they're more likely than not to move in with a family member, like a child. And then also, I think this is important to note too, that living alone is associated with financial problems. And so by sharing those economic responsibilities, there can be a decrease in stress and the financial burdens that are often experienced by people living in this stage of life. 1963, Havinghurst and Albrecht came up with one of the first aging theories by studying a group of older adults. And they concluded that society expects retirees to remain active in their communities. And they then published this theory suggesting that staying occupied and involved is necessary to having a satisfying late life. What do you think? Do you think that these things are important? Do people need to be occupied? Do they need to stay involved? Or do you think that there may be some limitations that people during this stage of development have that may affect how involved they can be and what kinds of activities they can engage in? One criticism of Albrecht and Havinghurst's theory is that the choice of older adults to engage in activities can be limited by physical capabilities, by finances, and access to social resources. But what does the research suggest? The research overall suggests that remaining active in old age is desirable, and there's a relationship between being active and life satisfaction among older adults. What we see today is we see lots of communities who have centers for seniors where they promote engagement and activity. And these centers provide very low cost, if not free activities, and they're very easily accessible to older adults. I'd encourage you to visit your local senior centers. In Johnson City, we have one where older adults can spend time socializing, they can take swimming lessons, they can take different classes related to physical activity. They can play cards. They can just sit and visit with one another. And anytime I've ever visited this senior center here in Johnson City, it has been very busy and very well taken advantage of by the older adults in our community. Some research suggests that generativity may be the single most important factor in achieving ego integrity. Many older adults achieve generativity through volunteering, and actually African American adults have the highest volunteer rate. Another way for older adults to be generative is through raising their grandchildren. This, of course, can be very challenging. Sometimes this comes about because of traumatic events. Traumatic events may be the death of that grandparent's child so that they are then left to raise their grandchild. Or it may be that their child has an addiction or serious mental health issue that's then resulted in the grandparent needing to take on that parental role with their grandchild. There are many challenges to this though. Grandparents can be overwhelmed by this because of the reduced energy that they have and their own unique health challenges that they have in their own lives. In addition, as we've talked about, there are unique challenges experienced in late adulthood. And this then can be exacerbated by needing to raise a grandchild. Also, the cost of education can be very expensive. And then transportation to education can be a challenge if we're talking about older adults who may be economically challenged, or if there are health issues that may make it more difficult for them to transport their child or their grandchild to and from school. Also, housing challenges can be an issue. For older adults, not all places that older adults live that are dedicated to older adults allow for children to live there. And so this can be a unique challenge experienced by people in late adulthood. There are some communities throughout the United States where older adults live that are dedicated to older adults with grandchildren because it has become such a significant issue and need within the United States. Social networks play a very important role in healthy aging, and the convoy model suggests that individuals are surrounded by supportive others who move with them throughout the course of life. And these relationships vary in their closeness, their quality. Are they positive or negative? Their function. Do they provide aid? Do they provide feelings of closeness? Do they provide affirmation for the older adult? And then their structure, their size, their composition, how often contact takes place, their geographic proximity, And the structure, function, and quality of convoys are also influenced by personal characteristics of both the people in the social network and the older adult themselves. And this includes age and gender. And it can also be affected by situational characteristics, like the culture's norms and our values. So within different cultures, there are different expectations for the role that people in the older person's social network play. And if we think about close relationships, close family, in many cultures throughout the world, it is expected that close family members will take care of older people. And when people don't fulfill that responsibility, it can be viewed as very shameful. In our culture, there is often that expectation, but it's certainly not as significant or not as intense of an expectation as you might find in more collectivistic cultures. And this relationship, these social connections, have significant implications for health and well-being. As people get older, their close relationships, according to this model, maintain stability, whereas their peripheral relationships, those with coworkers, neighbors, perhaps people who are distant, more distant friends, become less stable. Let's take a look now at socio-emotional selectivity theory. And this theory suggests that motivation for social contact changes with age. This theory suggests that as people age, they become more selective in the goals that they pursue, with older people tending to prioritize goals that will lead to meaning and positive emotions, and younger people pursuing goals that will lead to the acquisition of knowledge. So this is a lifespan theory of motivation. And what it's suggesting is that as our time horizons grow shorter, our goals shift so that those who have more time prioritize future-oriented goals. So compare yourself to your grandparents and think about what you invest your time in compared to your grandparents. Of course, there are always individual variations. Not everyone follows these basic patterns that we see, but these are general patterns that we tend to see throughout the lifespan that are supported by research. And also, remember, with this theory, those with less time prioritize present-oriented goals. What's interesting too about this theory is there's something called the positivity effect. And this suggests that older adults have a preference for positive information over negative information. So that in contrast to young adults, older adults tend to pay more attention to and remember positive information over negative information. Again, these are tendencies. This is not true for every single person. There may be unique issues and challenges experienced by the person in late adulthood who does not follow this pattern, but this is a general pattern that we tend to see. I think it's important for us as we look at theories to think about the different explanations for why we may see these patterns. So in terms of the positivity effect, some researchers suggest that the positivity effect is the result of cognitive decline because positive stimuli are less cognitively demanding than negative stimuli. But I should say that research has shown that older adults who have higher levels of cognitive control tend to exhibit also a strong preference for positive stimuli. So while there are these potential alternative explanations, such that that positive information is less cognitively demanding, positive affect or the positive affect and seeking out experiences that maintain that positive affect seems to be the result of older people using their cognitive resources to selectively process information that's going to meet their goal to experience more positive and less negative emotion. Friendships also play an important role in late life, and they provide a source of emotional support and physical support. And overall, friendships are associated with better health outcomes, especially following widowhood. As I've mentioned, widowhood is viewed as a significant life stressor, and there are many different variables that affect how well a person adjusts. Extroversion seems to be important. Perhaps that's because when a person's more extroverted, they're more likely to have a higher number of social ties or social connections, a greater level of self-efficacy. Self-efficacy is the sense that you feel like you are capable of doing things. And so when you have higher feelings of self-efficacy, this is going to then lead to a less stressful experience of widowhood and help lead to better adjustment. Also, receiving emotional support from other people is very important in helping people to adjust. And then the predictability, as I mentioned a little while ago, for people who are younger and they experience widowhood, adjustment can be much more difficult, especially if that person, if the couple has children that are young. Whereas in late adulthood, when a spouse passes away, this is much more predictable. And this then can help with adjustment, especially when we're thinking about having social support, so that if you have a spouse who passes away and you're in late adulthood, you're very likely going to find easily people who are also going through the same thing that you can connect with. And there's something called the widowhood mortality effect, and this is the higher risk of death that one has after the death of a spouse. The reasons for the widowhood mortality effect aren't fully clear, but it seems to be that stress plays obviously a very important role, and we know that stress can affect health and well-being. Research does suggest that spouses who are close in their marital relationship tend to be more depressed following widowhood than those who are not as close. And there was a study done several years ago that suggested that widowed men have a higher risk from dying from chronic obstructive pulmonary disease. We talked about that just a little while ago in part one, COPD, diabetes, accident, a serious fracture, infection, the months that are following the loss of their wives. And for women, they found that there was an increased risk also of dying from COPD, from colon cancer, from accidents, serious fractures, or lung cancer in the months that are following their husband's deaths. It seems that the first 3 months are the most critical, where people whose spouses have just died have a 66% increase chance of dying themselves within the first 3 months following their spouse's death. However, once people pass that point of 3 months, the risk tends to go down. And by about 18 months, the research has suggested that people tend to regain their earlier levels of health that they had prior to their spouse dying. So this means returning to both their physical and their psychological health by about that point. For those who do want to date in this stage of life, it can be difficult because they're experiencing retirement, they may experience relocation, they may have disability, and then this then results in a shrinkage of social networks. And so to compensate for this, many adults in this stage of life have turned to social networking and then therefore are using online dating to satisfy their needs for companionship or forming relationships. For men who are seeking a partner or a dating relationship online, they tend to seek physical attractiveness and they offer status that's related to information. And they want younger women. And they're also more interested in repartnering, whereas women want older men until about the age of 75. And older women don't want to become caregivers or widowed again. So their perspective on relationships is quite different from men who are not thinking about becoming caregivers, predominantly perhaps because they haven't been the primary caregiver in their home. So that's not a role that they're worried about needing to repeat. And for women, they also want to be able to maintain their personal and their financial independence. When people do remarry in late life, their marriages tend to be more stable than those of younger adults. They tend to experience this because they have better emotional maturity and they tend to have more realistic expectations about relationships. Also, emotional support from friends is negatively correlated with seeking romantic relationships. In other words, for people who are older who have high levels of emotional support from friends, they're less likely to seek romantic relationships. For many people who are older, they're simply wanting companionship but not marriage, as I've mentioned earlier. Also, I think it's interesting to note that cohabitation is increasing among older adults. Some researchers suggest that the reasons that cohabitation has been increasing among older adults is because we're seeing baby boomers who are becoming older adults and their views about marriage are different than previous generations. And that perhaps the whole idea of marriage for this group of individuals starts to fade and personal happiness becomes more important. Also, baby boomers themselves, when they were in their 20s and 30s, many of them cohabitated. And so this isn't something that's new for them. And people are much more accepting of cohabitation today than they have been historically. Also, we can think about the financial benefits of cohabitation where two people are pooling resources into a single household. And this then can result in improved economic stability, especially for women who, as I mentioned earlier, are at a higher risk for poverty. Two, I think it's important to note that cohabitation comes with some economic protections. Older adults today have much more debt than previous generations. And when people don't marry, they are not then responsible for their cohabitating partner's debt. Whereas if they were married, they are responsible for their legal spouse's debt. Also, when we think about Social Security, pension benefits, remarrying can affect those benefits. So if you have a partner and your partner has passed away and you've been receiving Social Security survivors benefits, checks may stop when you remarry. And so here we see that also, when you're in a relationship with someone you're cohabitating with, even if they have a high level of assets, this won't affect other benefits that you might be receiving, like Medicaid. let's take some time to explore substance abuse in late life. 2.5 million people in late adulthood have a substance abuse problem. There are many different risk factors for developing a substance abuse issue. These risk factors can include social isolation, depression, and pain. There are many different triggers like retirement, the death of a family member, the death of a spouse, a close friend, or even a pet, a loss of income or financial strains, being relocated or being placed in a nursing home, having trouble sleeping, or having family conflict. Drug and alcohol abuse among people in late adulthood is particularly dangerous because people at this stage of life are more susceptible to the deteriorating effects of these substances. And individuals who are over 65 have a decreased ability to metabolize drugs or alcohol, along with an increased brain sensitivity to them. This makes it dangerous then for people who are in late adulthood to use drugs or alcohol at all, even if they are not addicted. The danger then can be also compounded if that person in late adulthood is already taking additional medications that are prescribed. And when those medications interact with drugs or alcohol, this can cause very significant effects for that person, including death. Benzodiazepines, and some of you may be familiar with this class of drugs that are used to treat anxiety or insomnia. They are some of the most dangerous prescription drugs for people in late adulthood. And this is because they are particularly highly addictive. And the rate of people in late adulthood who are becoming addicted to benzodiazepines has increased every year. There's a significant challenge in identifying addiction in people in late adulthood. Alcohol or drug abuse can actually mimic symptoms of other medical or mental health disorders like diabetes or dementia or depression. And so doctors who encounter an older patient who has some symptoms that are related to substance abuse, but that could also be related to medical or mental health disorders, may think that what they're seeing in the patient is more related to declining mental or physical health, or in general to old age. And so the older adult may not get the help that they need. What is it that contributes to successful aging? Well, Rowe and Kahn in 1997 came up with a model of aging that is perhaps the most well-known and most applied model of successful aging. And it suggests that successful aging, or aging that is better than average, is a combination of three components that include avoiding disease and disability, high cognitive and physical function, and engagement with life. This was an important model when it came about because it offered a lot of opportunities for, especially in the field of gerontology, for funding programs to begin to view elders as able, valuable people in society who would benefit from having engaged lives. Another approach to thinking about successful aging is known as selective optimization with compensation. And this model takes the global view that at all stages of human development, we manage our lives successfully through the developmental regulation processes of selection, optimization, and compensation. Selection refers to an individual focusing their attention on fewer, more important goals. In other words, they are rescaling or restructuring or reconstructing their goals. Optimization involves engaging in goal-directed actions and means. Examples of this might include investing time and energy into learning things, into acquiring knowledge, into seizing the right moment, into being persistent, or learning new skills and practicing skills. And then compensation involves maintaining a given level of functioning in the face of loss and decline in goal-relevant means by people investing in compensatory means. So to review, selective processes are necessary because people need to make decisions throughout their lives that are related to where and how to invest their efforts. Compensation or compensatory processes play a role also across the lifespan because of the possibility of failure and loss of action at any point in life that needs to be counterbalanced. And then optimization requires the reciprocal and dynamic interplay of selection and compensation and addresses the possibility of developmental growth throughout life. In other words, growth opportunities in one behavioral domain may be optimized by selecting out of another, perhaps a less loss-affected domain. A very practical example of this would be finding alternative transportation when one can't drive. Overall, a person in late adulthood is making adjustments to continue living as independently and actively as possible, and they're compensating by choosing other ways to achieve their goals. There's a lot that we could say about the overall physical, cognitive, and psychosocial changes that take place during late adulthood. Overall, though, we can think about aging as a process of general, irreversible, progressive physical deterioration that occurs over time, but one that lifestyle and environmental factors affect. Aging is also social. It's a time of loss and a time of enhanced relationships too. Ageism, though, can exacerbate the effects of the unique stressors that are experienced in late adulthood. We've also looked at several of the different theories of aging and different conceptions of age, like chronological age, biological age, psychological age, and social age. There are many different variables that affect aging that can include genetic factors, health, education, mental activity, physical activity, personality, the social and cultural variables that affect each of us, sex differences, racial and ethnic differences too. We also need to keep in mind that late adulthood is a time of unique stressors that can affect mental and physical health. The effects of these stressors can be modified, though, by things like our sense of self-efficacy, coping strategies, and social environment and support. We also need to keep in mind that the culture within which a person lives and how individuals within that culture view aging can have a significant effect on how well an older person ages.